an austerity deal done under the auspices of the International Monetary Fund, involving significant cuts in public expenditure, involving the abolition of energy subsidies, so therefore soaring energy prices, especially at this time. People will know globally they're soaring, all in order to pay back debts which are owed by virtue and racked up by the former dictatorship, and which in no sense then are legitimate debts or debts that are owed by the ordinary people of Sudan, and debts that should simply be cancelled. And yet the interest of Western imperialism and capitalism is to say, well, you have to pay these debts and to impose horrific austerity on the Sudanese people. And I think it's also important to point out and be honest about the fact that the EU, that Western capitalist countries are absolutely no friend of democracy or human rights. I was a member of the European Parliament at the time of the first wave of the uprisings and revolutionary movements in North Africa and the Middle East, which are known as the Arab Spring. And that compelled a very swift change in terms of the rhetoric of the likes of the European Commission, where they became on paper in favor of democratization in the region. But in reality, they had up until that point backed the dictatorships. In relation to Sudan, they had explored various quite horrific deals involving the giving of significant repressive machinery, surveillance, etc., to the former regime of al-Bashir, with the aim of, we'll give you all of this equipment, we'll give you a bunch of money, and what you will do is we will externalize the borders of Europe. You will be our border guards for the racist policy of Fortress Europe. And of course, you can use these repressive weapons for whatever other purpose that you want to use them for. The reality is what they are aiming to do, their only interest in the region is not democracy or human rights or anything else. It's maximizing the profit of the corporations that they represent, and giving a place of so-called stability for them to intervene throughout in the region in particular. For example, the CIA was previously quite an advocate for friendly relations with the al-Bashir regime, because the CIA operated a very large center in Khartoum, and they maintained good relations and so on. And I think that's just important to bear in mind. So I checked on the Department of Foreign Affairs website and the Irish government, and they have a statement in line with the EU position, which is condemning the coup. But we should definitely note that they're condemning the coup not because in reality they have any sort of principled commitment to democracy, but because they want to see stability maintained at whatever cost, and in reality would oppose the second wave of the revolution that's underway. And then, of course, more blatantly, you have crucial allies of US imperialism, the UAE and Saudi Arabia, which openly supported the recent coup. So the way we see our role here is to speak out in support of the Sudanese revolution, against the murderous repression and against the complicity of the European Union. We've spoken a number of times in the Dáil, the Irish Parliament, at it in relation to it, and we'll continue to do so. We also have a press conference planned for Thursday with a number of Sudanese activists to again highlight these points into the Irish media to raise awareness. And the other thing that I would urge people to do is we can share through the chat various model resolutions for people to try to pass through their trade unions in support of the revolution, particularly in the context of the workers' movement being absolutely central to the revolutions that we've seen in Sudan. Just the final points while we wait and see whether Magdi is here, and obviously all these would have made more sense coming after Magdi, but nonetheless I still hope that they'll be worth something, and then I'm very interested in what Magdi has to say. It's just some observations which are very much from afar, from reading articles by Magdi and others. who were involved in the revolution, which is that for us, obviously, the primary duty is the question of solidarity. But an aspect of solidarity is also learning the lessons. Because as I think she even mentioned at the start, I mean, we want to make an eco-socialist revolution in this country, and we want to see eco-socialist revolutions to take place worldwide. And to do so, we have to try to learn through dialogue from those involved in revolutionary movements currently, as well as learning from historical experience. And so in that vein, just three quick observations, which I'd be most interested in the opinions of the Sudanese activists in particular in relation to. One is the thing that is striking watching events unfold over the past month or so is the extent to which they're kind of a confirmation of what Marx wrote about France in 1848, that the revolution advances under the whip of counter-revolution, that you have had an attempt by the military to completely turn back the clock on the kind of partial democratic reforms or semi-democratic reforms that were made to retake power fully into the military's own hands in a kind of open way. And the reaction to that has been a second wave of revolution that isn't satisfied at the idea of a return to the status quo pre kind of a month ago and the attempted coup. But instead is now a widespread awareness amongst the masses involved in making the revolution that the military does not want any form of real democratic transition, and the generals will act to block any form of real democratic transition because they simply have too much to lose. Economically, they directly or indirectly control very, very large parts of the economy. And in terms of their own power at the top of the state and the impunity that they currently benefit from, that their war crimes, their crimes of repression, etc., what they would be answerable for in a true democratic reckoning is not something that they want to experience. And therefore, we now appear to be at a new stage of revolution where you have a widespread understanding that there can be no compromise with the generals, and that there's now a distrust of those who seek to pursue that idea and that strategy of compromise with the generals. The second point is, again, an observation, but again, it seems striking over the past number of years in terms of the process of the revolution in Sudan, but is the very obvious and central role of the working class in the revolutionary movements in Sudan. In particular, the Sudanese Professionals Association, which brought together, I think, 17 different trade unions in Sudan, was a central and driving force of the revolution, but also the methods of the working class, the question of a general strike in particular being a key weapon in first revolution and now in fighting back against the coup. And the third point, which I know Magdi has written about, and I'd be interested in more discussion on, is the question of the emergence of what are known as the resistance committees, where effectively it's a way that the resistance and the revolutionary movement has been organized, as far as I can understand, at a local kind of not neighborhood level, as an instrument of organizing the revolution, but also in taking on some of the functions of the running of society. In one of Magdi's articles, he talks about it taking on some of the micro roles of government and displacing what were kind of previously regime linked to the dictatorship committees known as the popular committees, of course, not in reality being popular committees, but effectively them being displaced by the emergence of these resistance committees. And it seems to confirm like a general law of revolutionary processes, which is that when a revolution goes deep enough and workers are kind of organizing their own struggle, they also have to organize the aspects of their own society, and you have the emergence in embryonic form of how you could organize society on a very, very different basis. And that if the revolution was to continue and to not settle for kind of democracy on paper or democracy in words, but instead would to say, well, we're not only going to oust the military from rule in politically, we're also going to oust them from their control economically. We're going to transfer the massive resources that are held by the military into the hands of ordinary people. We're going to transform society along democratic socialist lines. Well, then it certainly seems to me, and I'm interested in hearing more from the Sudanese friends and comrades we have here. It seems to me that we have the potential, that they have the potential to become the kind of the basis or the beginnings of the basis for an alternative democratic form of socialist state. So I'll leave it there, and I'm very interested in what others have to say.
Thank you so much, Paul. I really appreciate that, especially when you weren't expecting to have to go first. The situation is obviously quite, quite live and quite up in the air. And as such, we don't have Magdi at the moment, and we're trying to see whether we can get Magdi. But in the meantime, we are hoping that Mohammed, or if there are any other Sudanese comrades in the meeting, if you could just alert me and put your hand up, because we do want to keep this conversation going. It's a really good conversation. And while we're trying to get Mohammed, we'd be really happy to hear from any of the Sudanese comrades. So is there anybody here? I think I saw, okay, there's a hand. Okay. One moment. Great. I'm trying to, okay. Okay, thank you. Can you unmute yourself, please? Tariq, isn't it?
Yes, good evening, everybody. Yes, my name is Tariq. I'm from Sudan.
Awesome. Well, if you'd be willing to share a few words with us and tell us what's going on, that would be really brilliant.
Okay, but why don't we give Magdi another 5 minutes, because he is the official speaker.
Okay, so Magdi, I hear Magdi is on his way. So that's great. And we will give Magdi another 5 minutes. Would you like to say a few words while we are waiting for Magdi?
Okay, first of all, I would like to thank your organization for bringing the issue of Sudan to the Irish public domain. And in fact, the people of Sudan are very frustrated following the pact or the deal which was signed between Hamdock, the former PM, and now he's supporting the people who staged the coup, and he's going to work with them as prime minister. This is the situation which most people don't know more details about. The people who took to the street opposing the military coup d'etat of October 2021, their demands were very clear. They were asking for a full-fledged civilian-led government, and they made it very clear that they don't want. They asked the military to go back to their barracks. Now this deal is a blow to the revolution, if you like, because most Western countries and some Arab countries in the region are supporting the deal, unfortunately. And they are sending a message to the military that there are people in the West who are very much interested in the continuation of this military rule, because this is the best way to pursue their interest in Sudan. I'm going to just mention some of the statements made by the American government. At some stage, the American government made it clear that they just want any form of another partnership with the military during the crisis when Hamdock and the other former ministers were in custody. And they made it clear, even with or without Hamdock at some stage. So the point I'm trying to make is that the people of Sudan who are still adamant to go ahead with their protests, the peaceful protest, they have no support whatsoever from the so-called international community. The countries in the region, in particular the United Arab Emirates and Saudi Arabia, they have interest in Sudan, as you know. The militia of the Janjaweed, the rapid support forces of Hemeti, they are doing the dying on their behalf in Yemen. This is one of the points which has to be clarified for those who are not familiar with this. So Egypt is not a democracy. It is a dictatorship. And they see a fledgling democracy south of Egypt is a threat to them. They don't want democracy to spread to the north. So they have a vested interest in maintaining the status quo. By maintaining the status quo, I mean, according to this deal, the people who are wielding the real power are the military. Hamdok will have no power. Believe me, I know that. And I don't think that this pact is going to hold. At some stage, things will get worse. And I'm afraid that Sudan will follow countries like Libya or Yemen or those who have no strong central governments at the moment. And this is, I think, is part of what is called the I can't remember the expression which was attributed to the former foreign minister of foreign affairs. I think it was Condoleezza Rice. Condoleezza Rice, yeah, she mentioned that at some stage the Americans have to follow a new approach in pursuing their interests in the developing countries through creative chaos. Yeah, this is what I was trying to remember. So this creative chaos, I'm afraid, is going to reach Sudan, although the people of Sudan are very aware and very careful about the consequences. So they just want especially the young people. I just give you maybe a very shocking example of the brutality they are facing. Just in the last 3 weeks, if you like, 41 people were shot dead. Some of them were brutally shot directly on the head, in the head. Girls and boys. The average age is 19. Some of them are even less than 18 years of old. So the situation is very gloomy and people are very frustrated, especially after they realize that nobody is serious about supporting their, peaceful protest so that they can realize their aspirations for justice, peace, and democracy. I leave it there, and maybe later, if there is any point needs elaboration, I can try to contribute. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Tariq. Really appreciate that. And I am very happy to say that that Magdi is now here with us. So I'm going to ask Magdi to come in now. And thank you very much for joining us. And thank you to any and all Sudanese comrades who are here, and indeed to everybody who's here to show solidarity. Magdi, I'll just ask you to unmute yourself whenever you're ready.
Thank you very much. I'm very sorry for the delay. I had a terribly hectic day. And I was caught up in several matters at the same time. So thank you for your patience. I'd like to pick up where my I don't know who was talking, but where the colleague who was discussing the regional and international aspects of these developments. And I think I'd like to add something about a certain Sudanese model of governance, if you like. Some of you might have known that there was a period of time where directly after the transition, the prime minister, who's now the prime minister of the coup, was speaking of sort of an ideal situation of military-civilian relations in Sudan, and was marketing this as a sort of a model for these type of relationships in the region. He might have been right in a way that he didn't intend to mean. And I think if you look, and to bring a bit more international aspect to this so that it could be of interest to a wider audience, if you look across an arc of countries stretching from Afghanistan to Iraq, and then Yemen and Libya, and Sudan is an early arriver in the scene, you will see a model of governance where the militia, in some form or another, a commodified militia, a salaried militia, is taking the reins of government in different ways. And this seems to be a cheap way of doing governance. Now, Western countries, especially the UK, has a long record of governance in cheap ways, including governance by militia. In Sudan's own history, there was a period of time where rule by militia was a model, and that applies somewhere in the early 50s, where in the more distant corners of Sudan, it was recruitment of local militias that served government purposes and made that feasible. Now, what do these militias command? The colleague mentioned the contribution of the rapid support forces in the Saudi war on Yemen, and mentioned the United Arab Emirates. Now, in the past 6 months, in the first 6 months of 2021, Sudan exported a value of $1.1 billion of gold to the UAE. This is gold bought on the cheap, sold on the dear by the UAE. And the UAE is almost the single buyer of Sudan's gold. So there is a term in recent literature called monopsonic, which refers to a condition where a single buyer buys a commodity. And there is, of course, this is a feature of rentier economies, and it has been studied widely in the UK and in other countries. And you can see that in a place like Sudan, where a single buyer controls the market for gold. Similarly, Saudi Arabia has almost complete monopoly over the purchase of Sudan's animal wealth, which means it commands, at least for one half of the year, something in the range of 300 to 400 million US dollars. These are the main sources of Sudan's foreign currency income returns. Beside them, there are other basic commodities like sesame and sorghum, which contribute a minor share of that, but most of it is coming from gold and animal wealth. Now, both of these commodities come from the poorest areas of the Sudan, and these are areas that are governed by the militia. So the militia, besides providing some form of militarized security, also guarantees credit and disciplines labor force and recruits labor force, and itself becomes a form of labor in many ways. And it's also a way of taking over surplus labor and turning it into something that sells. And part of that surplus labor is what does the fighting. The teenagers who are fighting in Yemen from Sudan are a form of surplus labor that is being deployed elsewhere for monetary return. It's commodified labor in a way. So I think it's very important to consider this idea of government by militia as a new arrival. It's not particularly new, it's an old new arrival on the scene. And it's interesting to see how this is becoming an attractive model for Western countries to govern the global South, in that they outsource these functions to militias of various orders. And in this regard, it's interesting to consider something like the Hartoon Process, which is an agreement signed between European Union countries. At the time, the UK was still in the European Union, and I think Ireland is involved in a way or another. But mostly it's the bigger recipients of refugees that are involved. So Germany, Spain, Italy. And this agreement was signed under Bashir before the events of 2019, with the leaders of these militia groups to control the movement of refugees from Africa, people crossing through Sudan to the Mediterranean. And many of those come from Eritrea and Ethiopia, and Sudan is a transit country for these refugees, besides being an exporter of refugees itself. And the basic premise of the deal is that the European Union would provide logistical assistance, technical assistance, and probably some money too that isn't very transparent, and of course a bit of political cover in return for these countries becoming the southern border of Europe, controlling the movement of refugees, since this is a politically explosive topic in Europe that could cause governments to fall. Now, I think that some of that explains why there isn't much interest in democracy in these countries, and the preference is really for strong men. And of course, Sudan's new strongmen made themselves quite valuable in that regard by entering into security deals into the regional circuit of security in the Middle East, which is essentially governed by Israel. You probably all heard of the Abraham Accords, which is a set of agreements that were signed, that were sort of mediated by the US and signed between different Arab countries and Israel. One of those Arab countries is Sudan, which became a turning point in its foreign policy. And it was only possible after the deposition, after Bashir was deposed. And the military men who came in his place were willing and ready to take up that role and to consolidate their position as components of this regional security order. And this is one source of their strength, is the way that they, and I've now listed two. So their valuable asset as controllers of cheap commodities that are exported to Arab Gulf, and their role in a regional security order with Israel in the middle, and their provision of a fighting force in the wars of the Arab Gulf, which is essentially now the war in Yemen, and for a period of time it was also the war in Libya. And of course, these Arab Gulf countries that are punching above their height do not command the fighting force themselves, so they rely on outsourcing that function to militias like the RSF. And in that regard, this is the regional cover for Sudan's coup. Of course, Sudan's cities are not very happy about this, and you can see that there is a massive and broad and combative resistance movement on the street against the coup. However, this is a long shot. You're fighting not only the two men at the helm of power, or now the three men at the helm of power, you're also fighting a regional order, and that's why, and an international order, and that's why the type of solidarity that could be provided by an organization like yours or a political party like yours is of great help, in the sense that it can bring these struggles together. Obviously, there is no way of winning a democracy in Sudan without winning a democracy in the United Arab Emirates, or without toppling the kingly powers of Saudi Arabia, or without democratizing Egypt, or without building those bridges of solidarity with places like Ireland, that themselves have a long history of resistance to colonialism and oppression by greater forces. So I think it's relevant to consider these things and to bring to a general public in Europe what it means to be ruled by a militia. And I think my colleagues should explain a bit of that by saying within a few days, 40 young women and men were shot dead by sniper fire in the streets of a capital. Of course, this type of violence is not foreign to Sudan's peripheries. It's part of daily life in Sudan's peripheries, where the militia has been governing for a long time. It's only its arrival in the capital that is so novel. for stretching back to 2003, Sudan's westernmost region, Darfur, was essentially governed by such a militia and continues to be so, where violence and deadly violence is part of daily life. There is no sanctity for life in any form. And it's the necessity that this militia now is in the palace, has taken hold of the reins of the state, that makes a difference. Now, what that means for populations outside these countries in the Middle East and Africa, I think is the priority of parties like yours to explain what it means to rely on these types of violent means of governance to secure profits and to secure returns from cheap commodities in far-flung places like Darfur. However, it's not only Darfur. If you look at your own mobile phone, most of it would contain coltan. Now, coltan comes from a place like Congo, which has been ruled by a militia almost since the early 90s. So there is no such thing as a central power governing the Congo. It's a dispersed power between fiefdoms across a landscape of mines that exports cheap commodities to places like Europe. And you've seen this playing out in a place like Afghanistan, you've seen it playing out in a place like Yemen, and this seems to be a model that is being expanded across the region. I think I'll keep my comments there and listen what you guys have to say.
Thank you so much, Magdi. Such a valuable contribution, and very generous of you to come and speak to us here when I know that there's so much going on at the moment for you. So I'm going to have a look now and see if anybody has their hand up and wants to ask a question or make a comment. We have a short time for questions, and then we'll come back to Paul and Magdi. So I think Paul would have preferred to let you speak first, Magdi, but he took it away, and he'll probably want to come back as well after hearing you speak. So yeah, I'm going to ask people to stick their hands up if they have anything, if they have any questions or comments. Particularly would love to get contributions from Sudanese comrades. I can see that there's a few here, so we're really honored that you've joined us this evening. So I cannot see hands up at the moment. Okay, I can. There are now 2 hands up. Okay, so Kieran has his hand up. I'm going to bring in Kieran if you want to mute yourself or unmute. Yeah.
I think I have unmuted myself, have I? Yeah. Well, listen, first of all, on behalf of People for Profit, let's just give our absolute solidarity to the comrades who are fighting such a brave fight in Sudan. Just to say that on Thursday, we'll hold a press conference. We'll invite other parties such as Sinn Féin and indeed the Social Democrats to join us in highlighting in our parliament to the people of Ireland what's going on in Sudan, because the mainstream media aren't really covering such an important event. I just really have 2 questions more than anything, just more to get the discussion going. So I agree very much with Magdi that the fate of the Sudanese revolution is bound up with the fate of people in Egypt and Saudi Arabia. And these are brutal regimes that are, in the case of Egypt, have stolen a revolution and have murdered and massacred people in order to do that. And Saudi Arabia, despite the fact that the liberal West sometimes says it despises what's happening in Saudi Arabia, in reality, it is very much in alliance with Saudi Arabia and is very much using Saudi Arabia to promote its interests. But my question really is to Magdi or to anybody in Sudan. I mean, do you think that you can win democracy in Sudan, even for a limited period, before these regimes fall? Or do you think it has to happen simultaneously, or how do you think it's going to happen? That's question number 1. And the second question is really, in terms of Egypt, we know that the way the regime came to power was by pretending to be a secular force against the Muslim Brotherhood. And we know that, for example, in Sudan, the Bashir government has presented itself as an Islamic government. My question really is, how does the left relate to the Islamic movements in Sudan at the moment, and how does that feature in the revolution?
Thank you, Kieran. And I'm sure that Magdi will come back on that. In the meantime, we have a few more people who want to come in. So Mohammed would like to come in. I'm going to invite Mohammed in now. So just, yeah, unmute yourself. And
all right. So I have one question for Magdi. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
So what Magdi said about that there can be no democracy in Sudan unless there is also democratization of Egypt, Saudi Arabia, and UAE, the axis of evil that controls the political scene in Sudan. So my question is, it seems that Saudi Arabia and United Arab Emirates are unique countries. And what I mean is that if there to be a democratization of these countries, how that can happen where like the vast majority of citizens are like rich and like they have no incentive to change their own countries. Whereas, for example, Egypt on the other side, the demography there is similar to Sudan. I can imagine that it can happen like another revolution in Egypt in 10 years or so. But I think the situation is kind of different in the Gulf. I know that there is a class of people who are exploited there, who are mostly from Asia. But as far as I know, there is no organization there, or I really find it hard to imagine how any change can happen there in these countries. Although, like I said, there is like proletariat in a typical sense of the word there. But I'm just wondering, what does Magdi think about that?
Thanks a million. Okay, I'm going to ask Jess to come in now.
Hi there. Thanks so much to Magdi for the presentation. Also, thanks to Paul. I just had a question about the role of women, because on social media and in the news reports in 2019, there were many, many images of women playing a leading role in the revolution then. And I had been wondering, what is the situation today? What is their role in pushing back against the coup? And how does that impact the fight for women's equality within Sudan?
Thank you very much, Jess. Tariq wants to come in again. So just unmute yourself there.
Thank you. Yeah, a few quick points. As Magdi mentioned earlier, the problem, the people of Sudan are now facing huge challenges because the countries in the region are continuing, with their policies, like the United Arab Emirates. Actually, the United Arab Emirates is seen by many people as a smuggling hub for the traffic gold, not only from Sudan, from other neighboring African countries as well. This is point number one. The point I'm trying to raise is about the Burhan, the general who is now ruling Sudan, the new dictator of Sudan. This guy is part of the old regime, the defunct regime of Omar al-Bashir. He was appointed by al-Bashir, and he is accused of atrocities carried out in Darfur at some stage. And now he is trying to bring back the old guards to the government. Just 2 days ago, he was appointed a prominent general as his manager of the security organ in Sudan. And there are some videos, I can't actually share with you these videos now, to prove that the guy who was appointed, his name is Mufaddal. He was the governor of South Kordofan, and he was an adamant supporter of Bashir. This is another blow to the Sudanese revolution. My last point is about Hamdock economic policies. As earlier mentioned, as I think some of you, the first speaker mentioned that earlier, the IMF and the World Bank usual prescription. First of all, people have to know that both Hamdock and his former finance minister Al-Badawi, both of them are strong advocate of the Washington consensus. The Washington consensus, as everybody, as most of you know, is advocating for a savage form of capitalism. And this savage form is capitalism is adopted by the international financial institutions, such as the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank. And this is what is happening in Sudan. They started implementing these prescriptions without any regard to the consequences. I just give you one example. I was in Sudan just before the coup. I was back from Sudan. In my hometown, which is called Bara in the state of North Kordofan, all of a sudden, farmers found themselves in limbo because the subsidies on diesel were all of a sudden removed, and they had to go to the market and buy diesel for their water pumps from the market. As a result of this, most of them couldn't afford it. And as a result, a lot of them have already abandoned their farms and nobody cares about them. This is a very important point, which I would like to see, probably make this comment on it. This IMF prescriptions has inflicted an incredible suffering on the Sudanese people, the ordinary Sudanese people. And now people are fighting. No, probably the majority can't put food on table because of the soaring prices of these basic commodities. Thank you.
You're muted there, Shiva.
Sorry. Thank you, Tariq. I'm going to bring in John Mulloon now.
Thank you, Shiva. And first of all, a big thank you to Magdi, to Tariq, to Mohammed, and all the Sudanese comrades who've spoken in this meeting. Thank you for coming to the meeting in the first place. And obviously, a starting point from all of us is our complete solidarity with your struggles, as Kieran said. I want to start by saying that I thought that the Sudanese revolution, as it developed at the end of 2018 and early 2019, was hugely inspiring and for us all. It was absolutely magnificent to see. Indeed, the demonstrations of the Sudanese people that occurred in O'Connell Street in Dublin in solidarity with it, they themselves were extremely inspiring. And in both in Sudan and in Dublin, Jess Spears' comment about women, one of the most inspiring things about them was the wonderful role played by women there in Sudan and here in those demonstrations. So having said this, I also wanted to say on the question of Egypt, and I've had quite sort of close links with Egypt since before and after the Arab Spring, that a successful revolution in Sudan will undoubtedly be of enormous assistance to a revolution against the al-Sisi dictatorship, that brutal dictatorship in Egypt. And in this situation, as in the Arab Spring, when it went from Tunisia to Egypt and then on to other countries, every country, a breakthrough in any country assists every other country in this. And the last point I want to give is really a question to Magdi. Magdi, do you think that the revolution should set as its goal not just a civilian government, but going beyond a civilian government? For example, to government by their people's committees. The reason I ask this question, right, we all want civilian rule, we all want the downfall of the dictatorship and so on. But what it strikes me, and it's again seeing the experience of what happened in Egypt, if the military go back to barracks, they stepped aside for a while in Egypt, they just go back to barracks and wait for their next opportunity. They retreat, they sign whatever it is they do, they say, okay, they get more money from the Americans or more money from the Saudis or more money from Qatar, and they come back at you again in 6 months or a year or 2 years. So I asked the question, we need to set a goal of going beyond just a civilian government? Thank you.
Thank you, John. I'm going to bring in Lena now.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for giving me this chance. And thank you so much for your solidarity with us. I have a question for Majdi. Don't you think that if we ordinary Sudanese people and organizations such as yours, Peoples Before Profit, cooperate together to change the narrative and our daily discourse about the global strategic interests in Sudan? I see from my own point of view the traditional colonialism that's still going on in Sudan by bringing allies in the region to rob Sudan of its wealth and of its natural resources. It's not working anymore. It's just planting more seeds for coming wars in the region. If we organizations and individuals can work together to change this narrative and change the equation to a win-win situation, I see Sudan can be a game changer in climate change. It's a very wealthy country. It can be really invested in the lands that's empty, that's full of war, that's full of fire, people dying everywhere. If really we could attract the interest of governments to invest in Sudan and to empower the Sudanese people to rule their country and to form a win-win situation. Is that possible? Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Lena. There's 2 more hands up, and I'm gonna have to stop the contributions there. And that's the last hands I can take. And I would ask you to keep it, brief if you can. I'm gonna bring in Reem and then Phelim, and then we'll go back to our speakers, Paul and Magdi. So Reem.
Hello, everyone, and thank you very much, People Before Profit. You've always been with us since the first sparkle of this revolution. I'm just going to make a comment regarding a question about the role of women in this recent move, or maybe the role of women in the revolution in general. And I'd like to confirm that they have been always in the front lines, even in the last precious 41 lives that we've lost since the 21st of October. There have been so many, let's say, iconic women among them. Maybe the most famous is the young nurse who has released the hashtag Pink for Kandaka. So either on Earth, back home in Khartoum, or even here in Dublin, and I think you guys would have seen most of us shouting and roaring in O'Connell Street, raising our voices, looking for democracy. So the role of women has been really, really upfront. Now that might put other issues of us at the back a little bit, given the fact that winning this battle and winning the peace and freedom would be our #1 priority. But I would like also to say that the signing of the agreement by Prime Minister Hamdock has caused a huge shake to the streets in Sudan and to us here. Some of the people would be thinking that maybe give the man a chance, maybe there will be something coming out of us. But what I would ask is, what guarantees did we have now that the militants have the goodwill to do it? they've never offered anything up until now, and it's only atrocity after atrocity. The main chief of police who've been appointed in the last few days made a comment in one of the meetings, like Mr. Tariq has said, that he was referring to the women being upfront, risking their lives, that they would be just a nonsense pushing men to risk their lives and get killed for no actual cause or no real cause. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Reem. I'm going to bring in Phelim now. And that'll be the end. And then we'll go back to Paul and Magdi.
Thank you. Solidarity, of course, from all of us. And thank you to everybody for being here. I just wanted to ask, what can we in Ireland do to help in any meaningful way? That was just the only question. Just what can we do to something concrete, you know?
Great question. And I think, and that's a really, really great question to go back to our speakers with. I'm going to bring Paul in first, because I think he has a question for Magdi as well. And then I'll let Magdi have the final word.
Great. Thanks a million, Shiva. And yeah, thanks a million, everyone for attending, but in particular, the Sudanese comrades who spoke and attended. Very enlightening to listen and inspiring to listen and learn from you. Yeah, the response to the last question first, because I do think that's the most important question for us. I mean, I think one, keep an eye out for solidarity protests and so on happening. I'm sure they will be organized again. Number two, if you're in a trade union, try to pass a resolution in opposition to the coup and in support of Sudanese workers and those making the revolution. And there are, I think Marnie put a link earlier to the MENA Solidarity website, which is it's MENASolidarityNetwork.com, whereby you can find various model resolutions and links and more information. So it's a useful place to start. And three, I think spread the information, spread the news about what's happening in your social media, in the circles of people you know, and so on. And those of us who have higher platforms in the Dáil or in the trade union movement in the parliament should then seek to do that on a larger scale, and then put pressure on the Irish government as part of the EU to stop its complicity in repression and the kind of austerity policies that we've been talking about. I just have a couple of other comments to make, and then mostly interested to hear from Magdi. So one point about the, I think it was Lena was asking or was making a point about the kind of international relationship of the revolutions, and the point has come up correctly about the role of the UAE, Egypt, Saudi Arabia, and I do think, like, it's, you know, one of the things that was very striking about the first wave of the Arab Spring was how it became such an international event and an international kind of consciousness around the idea of revolution coming back on the agenda. And that obviously started in a particular country of Tunisia, very quickly spread to Egypt, and very quickly spread across the entire region in reality, and then had echoes right around the world in the form of the Indignados movement in the south of Europe, in the form of the Occupy movement, particularly in the English-speaking world. You know, phenomenal impact in terms of global politics, and then all the complications that we understand in terms of that revolutionary process, which also had a side of counter-revolution to it, and John has made the points about Egypt, and the same applies today, in the sense that I think, and Magdi can explain his own view, but like, and so it's correct that you can't have a long-lasting, successful revolution in a country like Sudan while you have brutal dictatorships in Saudi Arabia, UAE, and Egypt. But that isn't a recipe for saying, oh well, we have to wait until we get a revolution somewhere else. It's it, in my opinion, is an injunction to make a revolution where we can now make a breakthrough and understand that that's going to have, you know, revolutionary reverberations across the region and across the world, and will open up new possibilities. And that's always the way in terms of kind of revolutionary periods open up. I'm reading a book at the moment about the so-called Spanish transition, the transition from Franco to democracy, which in reality was like a diverted revolution. There was a possibility for socialist revolution to take place in Spain, and that was sold out and diverted into kind of safe parliamentary capitalist and democratic channels. But when you read about it, what is just striking is how that wasn't just taking place in Spain. It was part of a continuum from France in '68, revolution in Portugal, the '70s, revolutionary movements in Greece, and then in Spain. And the Arab Spring was a kind of another version of that. And like a new successful wave of Sudanese revolution can have such an impact there. In terms of the question, so that was a very good question about, okay, fair enough, Egypt, where you have a radical left workers movement, you can envisage a revolutionary movement successfully taking place in Egypt. But what about Saudi Arabia and the UAE, where the standards of living of citizens is like wildly above those who are doing the work in those societies, or most of those who are doing the work in those societies? And I think, I mean, without it all being an expert, and again, I'm interested in Magdi's opinion, but the basic point I would make is that, well, it may be the case that in the UAE and in Saudi Arabia, that the revolution is not primarily made by those who were afforded citizenship, but is made by those who live there. I mean, the vast majority of those who live in the UAE are immigrant workers. They make up over 7 million of a 9 million population, and, you know, hugely, grossly exploited, obviously massively repressed, given no democratic rights and so on, but also with massive potential economic power. And I think, like, if you were a force trying to build in Saudi Arabia and the UAE, you'd have to have a big orientation to build in amongst the migrant workforce, and as the force for potentially driving change in those countries. And then the final point is just a question to Magdi, because he didn't get to hear it at the start, which is just a question about the role of the revolutionary committees. Have they re-emerged in a significant way now in kind of this wave of the revolution? How are they operating? I'd just be interested in hearing more about that. So thanks a million, everybody.
Thank you, Paul. So I'm not going to delay. I'm just going to ask Magdi to come in now.
Oh, thank you very much for sort of these are a long list of questions. I'm not sure I can satisfy all these theoretical demands. I mean, that's quite a chunk to chew through. But I'll begin with the last point, which I think is a worthy one, particularly in this audience. Now, as this is not an audience where I need to go through this, but you might be reminded that when the communist movement began as an internationalist movement and had one of its big banners, internationalism, on it, this idea has sort of gone down the sink for a long time. And I think it is a necessary idea to revive today. Obviously, in a place like UAE and Saudi Arabia, you would be relying on the distinction capital labor and not on the distinction citizen, non-citizen, since citizenship doesn't really clarify the lines of conflict in these countries. And that's not a very foreign idea. It seems foreign today, but it wasn't foreign a few centuries ago. The fact that people who inhabit a place and labor in a place have an actual right to it. And it is a certain idea that has resonance in Europe today in the midst of a migrant crisis, where it's also an issue about who has the right to be here and who hasn't. It's also a relevant topic to consider when some of you mentioned how inspiring the example of Sudanese protesters was on the streets of Dublin, that they are not only protesting as Sudanese, they're also protesting as Dubliners or residents of Ireland or Irish individuals, if you like. So I think you might want, at least from the perspective of a movement that wants to look beyond its borders, to go beyond this idea of citizenship and beyond the claims of nationalism. since whatever chances of success there might be for this wave of revolution, it has to be internationalist in scope. Part of the inspiring example of the Arab Spring was this notion that this is a fever that's spreading across borders, that it is an answer to a question that there is no national answer to the question of Egypt, and there is also no national answer to the question of Sudan. There might be some form of regional answer, and this one would have to involve the degree of penetration of Arab Gulf monies. There is considerable scholarship around this, in the sense how Arab Gulf capital has penetrated these countries and how it has come to control resources and to control political power and to design political power. The example of Lebanon recently is very telling, where a foreign country intervenes to decide who becomes information minister, and there was a big scandal around it, and the information minister was kicked out, probably in relation to his position towards the regional power. So I think these issues are well handled in a place like Ireland, especially with Ireland's record with Sudan. And that's an interesting point to bring up. In the 19th century, Sudan witnessed an earlier anti-colonial revolution led by a religious man, the Sudanese Mahdi. In England, he was scorned very much and cartoons were made out of him. In Ireland, he was a hero. Irish coverage of the Sudanese Mahdism was very welcoming and very supportive and showed a lot of solidarity. And they had a much more acute understanding of what colonialism means of a country based on that, in that regard. And it might be worthwhile looking back at that experience, how solidarity from a distant place like Ireland had an effect on events in Sudan and had an effect on the way the British public viewed the events in Sudan at the time. So I think there is a point to make about bringing back that international aspect and thinking in that way, instead of thinking in a closet form of nationalism, which is terribly relevant today, where you have working forces spread all around the world. And one very acute commentator said, one interesting thing about the Sudanese protests against the coup was that this is a revolution upon which the sun does not set, because protesters stopped in Khartoum and then began in Washington and then went on in Sydney and then started again in London. It was all around the clock, because they were Sudanese people all over the place, all around the world. And they, each from his position, contributed in a way or another. So as you can see the workforce globalizing, you could also imagine that these revolutionary impulses would be globalizing. That's an optimistic answer to one of the questions. Now I have to go back to my list. Now, there was a very good question about IMF policies and austerity. And I think that's, in a way, the chunk of it. When the world went through the financial crisis in 2008, Sudan was busy splitting oil dividends from South Sudan. There was a peace process going on. The big shock happened in Sudan in 2011, when Sudan, with the independence of South Sudan, lost oil revenues. And essentially what followed was a sequence of severe and punishing austerity measures that peaked in 2013, and sniper fire was seen on Hartoon Street at that time because people were protesting against the rise in bread prices. Now, protests came back again in 2019 that eventually toppled Bashir. To a related issue, bread prices, there was also an increase in bread prices and gasoline prices, all a summation of these austerity measures. When the transitional government took power, one of the first things it could push through, because it had the political power, the political capital to do so, was to enforce these austerity measures in full. So they floated the currency, they removed subsidies on fuel and wheat, subsidies on medicine were reduced, and the state was cut down to size, in the sense was reduced in its spending. So there was a trend towards reducing government expenditure and outsourcing many of these government functions, including security, to the militia form. in the hope that this would be a cheaper way of governance. Now, there was a question about the Islamic movement, and I think that's very relevant here, because you might want the way the Islamic movement operated in Sudan, as in other countries, deserves a bit more attention. Now, along the way in Egypt, the Islamic movement was largely an oppositionist movement because it was away from power. It didn't acquire power only recently. In Sudan, the Islamic movement was in governance since 1989. And in a way, it transformed into a class of people who appropriated public money and common goods. Because the main achievement of the Islamic movement for Sudan's ruling class was privatization. It unrolled its rolled out a long process of privatization that began in the 90s and is still continuing today in many ways. Even the people governing today do not differ in any distinct sense in terms of economic policy from what the Islamic movement proposed back then. So you need to think of it as not only as some sort of religious idea, but also a way of working neoliberalism in places where neoliberalism is foreign. It turned neoliberalism, sort of translated it into a local grammar. It used religion to roll out neoliberalism. And this is its contribution to the Washington Consensus. So as if you had the Washington Consensus with an Islamic face, if you like. It was a way of marketing the Washington Consensus in places that did not speak that language, that needed another grammar to make that chewable for a different ruling class. So that's just an idea I'd like to float. Now, there was also a question of whether you can go beyond the demand of civilian government to some form of popular rule. Now, as you all well know, this is a question of praxis. This isn't a question that you can ask in purely speculative form. It is the praxis of these committees, and there was a question about them, that will dictate the future of this movement. What sort of organizational models will they invent? In which ways will they be open to popular participation? In which ways will they design decision-making processes? And what type of ideas will they have in mind in terms of economic policy or linking urban struggles with rural struggles? And I think if there is anything that could be a key to success for Sudan's revolution, it would be to bring the struggles of the urban milieu in sync with the struggles in the countryside. And it is the countryside where the surplus comes from. And it is farm workers, agricultural laborers, people who artisan miners who pick up the gold, people who collect the sesame, who harvest the sesame, and most of them are women. It's a highly feminized workforce that is doing harvest work in Sudan's agricultural zones. It is the people who pick the Arabic gum, the people who make the country's surplus. And it is their struggles that are, at the moment, continue to be quite out of sync with these urban demands. And I think the challenge is how to link these two spheres, as much as the challenge is for an internationalist movement to link your struggles, for instance, in a place like Ireland, with struggles in faraway places like Yemen or Sudan. How do you bring these different struggles in sync? How do you create those solidarities? How do you weave them together? One reason for the success of the coup, for instance, 25th October, is that these two worlds operate on different scales, the urban and the rural world in Sudan. And that's an old and dominant feature of Sudan's political economy. The cities are sites of consumption, and the countryside is a site of surplus production. And it is a continuous feature of that political economy that the city live on this poor countryside, on this heavily impoverished countryside, while the city itself does not contribute very much to gross domestic product. It is largely a place of consumption. And this feature is as old as the Mahdi's revolution, where the cities were also sites of accumulation and the countryside were sites of expropriation. Now, bringing these struggles in sync, I think, is something that one needs to think about. There is a very important feature of the age that we live in, is that the idea of revolution is back, not because of some theoretical breakthrough, but because thanks largely to the Egyptian revolution. And if there is a single event in this century that deserves a big name, the mother of all revolutions, it would be the events in Egypt. These were momentous events that continue to have their effect in a place like Sudan. This is the prime example of what could popular movement achieve and not achieve. It's also a prime site of experimentation for counter-revolution. Now, almost all the tactics that played out in Egypt in the counter-revolutionary wave of 13 are playing out today in Sudan. Arab Gulf money, linkages to international capital, relationships with Israel, the regional security, security architecture, and so on and so forth. And the idea of a military strongman who can handle a raucous political class that doesn't want to listen. Now, these are common features, and you will see the example of the Egyptian counter-revolution playing out in a place like Tunisia too, where Qais Said just decided to scrap the constitution and invented a new order out of his head in alliance with regional powers. So you can see that Egypt is not only a place for these revolutionary tactics, which were in form and they took a more mature form in a place like Sudan, but it's also a place for where counter-revolutionary drawbacks or reversals happen and are experimented on. So I think that's something to consider very much. Somebody asked what Ireland can do to help. I think Ireland can do what it has done in the 19th century in relationship to Sudan's Mahdist revolution. It played an important role in translating that struggle taking place in dusty Sudan, far away, into something that a European audience can comprehend and relate to and understand. And it was an important contribution at a time where there were no social media, everything depended on the press. And the Mahdist revolution got fabulous press coverage in Ireland, and it's quite remarkable to look back at that sort of material. And a Sudanese scholar has recently dug this up, and he has written a very elegant book about it, about the reverberation of the Mahdist revolution outside Sudan. And one big chapter is dedicated to Ireland. And I think that's the type of contribution that somebody who thinks he's doing nothing is actually doing more than enough by translating Sudan's struggles into something that other people can relate to without going into the all difficult to pronounce names or the extreme detail that nobody can really fathom. You can't really fathom the details of struggles in every corner in the earth, but you can pick up the commonalities and you can transmit them to your own audience. All right, I think a colleague answered the question about women very well, but I'd just like to add that the degree of feminization of labor force in rural Sudan should make people a bit more sensitive to the issues facing rural women in Sudan, and not only the urban protests that you might see yourself in one way or another. And it is these invisible rural women who sort of contribute to Sudan's GDP and make up that surplus difference that make them a target for exploitation. Oh, I think I'll stop here, otherwise I'll go on and on Castro style. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much. We really, I think we've all gotten a lot out of your presence here tonight. And I know things are really crazy at the moment, and it's very generous of you, as I said, to come on and speak to us tonight. It's been a brilliant meeting, I think, and loads of people here, and really just so good to see how many Sudanese comrades have joined us tonight. As I mentioned in the chat, for those Sudanese comrades who are living here in Ireland, do consider getting involved with People Before Profit. We'd be absolutely honoured to have you. I put the link in the chat, but it's you can find it on ppp/join. And it's been absolutely brilliant. I think people are probably ready to go off and have dinner now or whatever, but our solidarity remains very much with you and with all of the Sudanese revolutionaries. So thank you again from People Before Profit, and we'll speak to you again soon. I'm going to leave it there, guys.
Thank
Good
you.
night, everybody. Good night, everyone, and solidarity.